Joe Hockey has said that no introduction is needed, and that's that's particularly true, I think, at this moment. And since our Treasurer is speaking first, that will apply to him, and by the time Bill English speaks, I may have my bio notes provided to me. So without further ado, can I introduce Joe Hockey, Treasurer of Australia. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gary. I do make a confession. A few years back, I had Harry Kewell come to my electorate, and he is a very famous soccer player. I didn't know that at the time. And I walked into a school hall with 1,200 kids who were very excited. And I said, "What am I doing?" They said, "You're introducing Harry Kewell." I said, "Who's Harry Kewell?" And at that moment, the MC said, "To introduce Harry Kewell, we asked the local member, Joe Hockey." And I got up there and I said, "Well, you don't want to hear from me. He needs no introduction, Harry Kewell." And they cheered. So thank you very much, Gary, and to my great mate Bill English. As someone with a bit of Kiwi blood myself, thanks to my Bay of Islands-born grandmother, I have a special affinity for New Zealanders, and none more so than my good mate Bill English. Now, I've known Bill for a number of years. We both have sons by the name of Xavier, which is a very Anglo-Protestant name, of course. And when he was in opposition for a brief time in New Zealand, he came and visited us when we were in government. And when we were in opposition for way too long here, I went to New Zealand to seek advice and encouragement from him. And I thank him for his advice. In fact, I well recall a chat we had in 2012 during my days in opposition when he came to visit me in my North Sydney office to discuss a speech I gave in London titled "The End of the Age of Entitlement." Well, Bill got it straight away. Sadly, it took a number of others a bit longer to understand what it really meant. But so much of the Australia and New Zealand story, which is much about shared values as it is about friendly sibling rivalry, particularly on the rugby pitch, much of it is based on the individual friendships that we have and also mutual ambition for our nations. Only a fortnight ago, I was in New Zealand with Bill where we further progressed the relationship between our two countries. And I have to admit, I'm just a little bit jealous of what they've done. New Zealand has stolen the advantage from Australia over the last few years by combining domestic structural reforms with newly negotiated trade opportunities in Asia. As a result, they have falling unemployment, rising living standards, and a budget that is coming into surplus. And New Zealand has not achieved that through luck or complacency. There's no she'll-be-right attitude there. They are not blessed with an abundance of energy and resources like Australia. New Zealand's success has come through the delivery of necessary economic reforms. And even with the advantage of a single parliamentary chamber, and at this very moment I am quite jealous, the delivery of reform has been a very great credit to Bill, to his Prime Minister John Key and their National Party colleagues. New Zealand is showing the world how economic reform should be done. Despite being a small open economy, the nation did undertake structural reform at the most opportune time, even though it was done against an incredibly difficult backdrop. With the full impact of the global financial crisis and the devastating Christchurch earthquake, and the rebuild cost almost 20% of GDP, to give you some perspective. The national government is on track to deliver a return to fiscal surplus in the coming year. In fact, since 2010, New Zealand's budget balance has improved by 7.5% of GDP. Australia's fiscal consolidation since then has been around a third of that. New Zealand has done this through careful use of public resources, sound economic policies, and a commitment to improving the quality of public services. Like Australia, it set out a credible path back to surplus and to paying down debt. But most importantly, it was able to stick to that. That means the government can spend more on things that New Zealanders actually need, like roads and ports, rather than using their taxes to pay interest on debt. In New Zealand, the sustained public sector efficiency improvements, reprioritisation of the government balance sheet, and changes to entitlements on schemes such as student loans, retirement savings and welfare, and that's one area that we've paid particular attention to recently. They're all impressive achievements. As the Deputy Prime Minister has said to me on a number of occasions, you have to fix the roof when the sun is shining. And it's a simple enough logic to make the tough changes when times are relatively good, because it is much more difficult to make meaningful changes in times of crisis. New Zealand also recognises that reform is an ongoing process. Bill English knows well, and indeed said in his budget speech 2 days after mine, reform must not end with achieving a surplus. A surplus is only part of the ever-continuing reform story. In New Zealand, the government's core expenses have come down from 35% of GDP in 2011 to a forecast 30% in the coming year. This compares with our expenses, which have increased over the same period by 1% of GDP. Last month, Fitch Ratings revised up their outlook for the New Zealand sovereign credit rating from stable to positive. Their unemployment rate is forecast to fall by almost a percentage point over the next couple of years. Unemployment currently sits in Australia at 6%, about the same as New Zealand. But while our rate is expected to increase to 6.25%, New Zealand's is expected to fall to 5.4%. So the New Zealand population is benefiting from a stronger economy, more jobs, and a government that lives within its means. It's also making itself a more attractive investment destination with a top personal tax rate of 33%. No payroll tax, and I understand no land tax either. Sounds a pretty workable model, doesn't it? Well, partly as a result of this, there have been significant turnaround in trans-Tasman migration flows over the past year. For the first time in years, more New Zealanders are returning from Australia than are departing to Australia. Kiwis are going home and staying home because times are good. So I commend you, Bill, for what you and your colleagues have achieved. You are changing the size and scope of government to build prosperity in New Zealand. It is these sorts of results coming from sound economic and fiscal stewardship which the Abbott government is working to achieve for the Australian people. Australia has been missing from the reform agenda for the past few years, but we can catch up. In a speech to the Australians Economic and Social Outlook Conference last month, I talked about the changing role of government. Governments must adapt to new disruptive technologies, new industries, and a changed mindset of our citizens. If we don't adapt, then we risk being left behind at the ballot box in both the long term and in the short term. The government's role is changing from an initiator of change to a facilitator of change. Australian governments have not taken the opportunities to facilitate that change in the economy in recent years. We now have the opportunity to build the environment for long-term prosperity, and we must take it. The first step in creating an environment for prosperity is to get the budget back in order and for Australia to start living within its means. By making the tough decisions now, we will free up future generations to react to challenges without being hamstrung paying for the spending of the current generation. In fact, Gary used the words a little bit earlier, which I thought were very impressive. He said, "We cannot redistribute what we do not produce." That is exactly right. Our interest payments of over $1 billion a month at the moment is not money well spent. It's dead money that doesn't create jobs, nor boost the economy. Without action, this will increase to $3 billion a month. And because 70%, around 70% of our government bonds are held offshore, if we don't fix the budget now, we're going to end up sending $2 billion a month overseas to people that we've borrowed money from. This is not a productive use of our taxes. Every dollar spent on interest could be better spent on our education system or on our health system. If we don't pay down our debt, we are more susceptible to external shocks, and we will not be in the best position to cope with the demographic challenges that face us, such as an ageing population or falling workforce participation. Just in the last 2 months, both Standard & Poor's and Moody's have warned that the inability of Australia to stabilise its debt would put pressure on our AAA rating. All three major rating agencies have commended the action taken by the government in the budget. Our budget restores sustainability to public finances by slashing projected government debt by almost $300 billion over the next decade, saving $16 billion in interest payments per year by that time. That is the equivalent of building 2 world-class teaching hospitals in each capital city each and every year. But we can only achieve that by taking action now. The Commission of Audit, released in early May, showed that without action, government would simply continue to become a bigger and more influential part of our lives, and the funding for this either being raised through higher taxes or more debt. The population shouldn't have to pay higher taxes in an increasingly competitive world, and we should not ask future Australians to pay for our current quality of life by borrowing money today that must be repaid tomorrow. Let me be very clear. Failure to fix the budget now will impact on our standard of living in the future. There is no alternative to the budget repair task. This is a view that's been supported by the Business Council of Australia, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, even our political opponents, Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, or Paul Keating's economic advisor who sits on the RBA board, John Edwards, described the current budget as in crisis. So it seems that the only people in denial at the moment are some members of the Parliament. As Dr Parkinson, the Secretary of the Treasury, said in June, it is quite another thing to exhort to vague notions of fairness to oppose any form of reform. If you do that, if you use such an argument to defend what is an unsustainable status quo, what you are doing is consigning Australia to a deteriorating future. Let's say that again. An unsustainable status quo, and if you continue to argue for that, you are consigning Australia to a deteriorating future. Therefore, anyone opposing the measures we set down in the May budget must think long and hard about the longer-term ramifications of their actions for the Australian economy and for society. At a minimum, they owe the Australian people an alternative. Any alternative. Any alternative. That's what we did in opposition. In opposition, we were upfront with the Australian people. We laid our policies down, such as Tony Abbott standing up in a budget reply speech in the Parliament before the election and saying we were going to abolish the school kids bonus. It took enormous political courage to do that, but he did it because we said at the time the mining tax wouldn't raise the money to pay for it. It had to go. So we had the political courage to lay down all our cards ages before the budget, ages before the election. And currently, our political opponents show no respect for what was the endorsement of the Australian people. We need to transform passive parts of our economy into productive ones, even going beyond the budget. All of us in this room know the economy is in the midst of a major transformation, moving from growth led by investment and construction in the resource projects to broader-based drivers of activity. This transformation is occurring at a time when the economy has generally been growing below trend. The unemployment rate has been rising, commodity prices have been falling, and the terms of trade are coming off. There are some indications the economy is starting to transition from construction activity to a broader story about growth in the economy. Most notably, housing sector construction is clearly responding to low interest rates. It was pleasing to see data released from the Reserve Bank last week showing that private sector credit growth has accelerated in June, rising 0.7% for the month, the strongest monthly increase since late 2008. All the indicators about the economy are heading in exactly the right direction because we are now providing stability of policy certainty about economic direction, and importantly, we are rolling out our reforms. The annual rate of private sector credit growth to June, as I said, was the strongest in over 5 years. Consumer confidence has bounced back. Business confidence, according to indicators yesterday, the highest rate in more than a decade. So they're all pleasing figures, but this is the start. This is only the start. We need to do more. We need to get broader base growth to bring the unemployment rate down and to support sustainable growth in our living standards. We can't rely on the resources industry to do the heavy lifting. And to do this, we've got to pursue a productivity plan. Productivity has consistently been the most significant source of income growth. Growth in productivity means that more or better quality goods and services are generated for the same level of resources. It will be the creativity, the innovation, and the risk-taking of businesses, investors and workers that will sustain and improve productivity growth in the future. But government policies and decisions can shape the incentives for work and enterprise and have a profound impact on current and future rates of productivity growth. However, much of government expenditure in the budget is simply not productive investment. That's why our budget decisions move expenditure from consumption towards investment that will increase our future productivity. And our infrastructure program and reforms to higher education are based on these criteria. We are kick-starting the non-mining sector of the economy by facilitating the building of $125 billion of additional productivity-enhancing infrastructure over the next decade. That's the modern-day equivalent of 8 Snowy Mountain schemes in additional infrastructure over the next decade. This investment will boost economic growth and jobs. It'll lower business costs, improve the quality of living by easing congestion. It will increase the productive capital of the economy and raise the speed limits to growth in the future. Importantly, we're ensuring that it's not only the budget funds more infrastructure, but we also get the right infrastructure to ensure that we get the best productivity impact. This means that the level of government that actually delivers key infrastructure is the one making the decision about what infrastructure they need. And our asset recycling fund works hand in hand with state governments to provide incentive payments as long as the proceeds from the assets recycled are reinvested into productivity enhancing infrastructure. The irony being that the Labor Party and the Greens in the Senate are opposing our asset recycling fund, and the two state governments that are most eager to sign up to the fund are two Labor governments in the ACT and South Australia. So it goes back to that old Paul Keating saying you don't want to stand between a premier and a bucket of money. The Parliament, of course, is opposing this. The Senate is opposing the asset recycling fund, which would mean that if it had its way at the moment, those senators in the Palmer United Party, the Greens, various independents and the Labor Party would stop the infrastructure that would result in $125 billion in new investments. Well, we're going to go around them. We're going to have it as an appropriation. We won't go through the fund. We will not stop the development of the new Australia. And we are going to do it in a meaningful way. All of the projects, of course, will have proper scrutiny, and as part of this, Infrastructure Australia will conduct a national audit of significant infrastructure that Australia needs, together with a 15-year plan. All projects where we're contributing funding in excess of $100 million will be assessed by Infrastructure Australia to ensure we get best value for taxpayer money, and importantly, they'll be required to publish justification for all project recommendations. These reforms are important because we need to get on with the job of building the other 90% of the economy that is not involved in resources or mining. At the same time, we've got to reduce the tax burden on Australians. We've already got rid of the carbon tax, and we're working with a diverse Senate to get rid of the mining tax. The mining tax is a tax on prosperity. The carbon tax was a tax on households and energy use. The abolition of the carbon tax will save Australian families on average around $550 this year alone, and the Australian economy will have increased cumulative output of over $1.3 trillion between now and the middle of the century. In 2050, gross national income per person will be over $4,000 higher by the abolition of the carbon tax. That's real and it's quantifiable. It will alleviate red tape burden for around 75,000 Australian businesses. And removing red tape is a key commitment that we made at the last election. We are delivering on with dedicated sitting days of the Parliament to remove regulation. We also want to get more Australians into work through work for the dole, changes to the social security safety net, and incentive payments to get older Australians back into a job. It's good news that some of these reforms have already started, and it's further good news welcoming that in the first 6 months of 2014, over 110,000 jobs have been created in the economy. Over 85% of these jobs are full-time. But we need to do better. I've said many times, if we can improve workforce participation and if we can improve female workforce participation, the Australian economy will be stronger. In fact, if we had the same level of female workforce participation as Canada, our GDP would be about $25 billion per year larger. Indeed, there are lessons to be learnt across the Tasman on this. Over the past 15 years, female workforce participation in New Zealand has been consistently 2 to 3 percentage points higher than that of Australia. In 2013, New Zealand's female workforce participation rate of ages 15 to 64 was 73.2%, 3% higher than us. And New Zealand's flexible workplace arrangements play a part in this. We've looked more broadly at the welfare system and the way it interacts with other areas of government. With over 1/3 of our government spending on welfare, it's by far the largest line item in our budget. We need a welfare system that is sustainable and targets assistance to those most in need. It also needs to encourage participation in either work or study. As a society, we have a social and moral duty to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. However, components of the welfare system, such as job search payments, should be temporary assistance rather than a long-term crutch for people. The goal of these payments should also help transition people back into work. The current system is outdated and has limited flexibility. We need to get more Australians into work, but getting them into work is only the start. Once they're there, we want them to stay there. If more young Australians are able to experience the dignity of work through secure employment, then the dream of social independence will become more accessible. Sustainability also underpins our reforms in both health and education. The Commission of Audit showed Commonwealth funding for Medicare grows at 7% per year. Similarly, it showed that Commonwealth higher education expenditure was growing at nearly 6% per year, all above inflation. The Medicare co-payment will be invested into what will be the largest medical research endowment fund in the world. And our higher education reforms will make sure that Australian universities are able to compete in an increasingly competitive university environment. There is a very strong link between the level of education and outcomes for employment and income. This government wants to create an environment where all Australians have more choices about the investment that they can make in their future. The strong education system is critical for our economy, and it needs to work hand in hand in building the future through health, medical research and a more engaged workforce. But I say to you, the budget is only the beginning. The reform process must be ongoing. There is no finish line for reform. The process of undertaking structural reform in Australia, or as you might call it in this forum, catching up to New Zealand, will continue with the reviews of the federation, taxation system, workplace laws, and in my area, financial system and competition policy. And it's important that these comprehensive and methodical reviews get the reform right. The work of the Australian and New Zealand School of Government has shown the importance of government process relating to reform, and it's important lesson is that you've got to be careful and methodical about the development of government policy. So the title of this session, what governments can and cannot do to grow national prosperity. Well, New Zealand has shown us what governments can do, and Bill and John Key have set a fine example. This is a time of transition for the Australian economy, and as a government we must embrace that challenge. Now's the time to fix our budget. Now's the time to start paying down our debt. Now's the time to facilitate greater productivity in our economy. Now's the time to start building long-term prosperity. And by creating an environment where businesses can grow and succeed, we will improve both the quantity and the quality of jobs available for ourselves and ultimately for our children. Indeed, if we want to improve the living standards that we have and those of our children and grandchildren, then now is the time to act. Thank you very much.